Morning. Welcome to Rooftop. My name is Matt, lead pastor at Rooftop. That video was put together by the World Bank, which is an international organization that provides loans to developing countries. And their mission as an organization is to help reduce poverty so that fewer people die of hunger and malnutrition in the world. Now, I'm sure you've heard the statistics about world hunger, but since world hunger is such an intractable problem with such devastating consequences, they bear repeating. According to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, there are 925 million hungry people in the world, most of whom live in Africa and Asia. 1 in 7 people, or 13% of the global population, does not have enough food to live. Over 5 million children die per year because of malnutrition-related causes and sicknesses and illnesses. That's all terrible enough. What's also terrible is how much of a cyclical problem that hunger is. People who are hungry have problems getting educated, finding jobs, staying healthy, and uneducated, unemployed, unhealthy people have problems getting jobs to pay for food to feed their children, who also go hungry and then end up uneducated, unemployed, and sick. So hunger kind of creates its own cyclical problem. What's even worse, though, is that there's actually, you might know this, there's actually enough food in the world to feed everybody. Did you guys realize that? There's enough food in the world to feed everybody in the world, and then some. The problem is distribution and purchase power. Poor people don't have enough money to buy the food that's like right next to them, or we can't actually get the food to the people in the world that need it before the food spoils, so people die with food like a few miles away that could make them live. Now, the world's leaders have long recognized the tragedy of malnutrition. They've organized to make a difference. In 1979, the United Nations sponsored the first ever World Food Day, which is held in mid-October. Even the World Bank has gotten into the game and recently launched the Put Food First campaign, which makes sense if you think about it. Food is our number one need as human beings. Can't live unless you have food, so put food first. Now, this all sounds obvious and important and well-intentioned. We all need food to live. People die from malnourishment. So put food first. But in John chapter 6, Jesus makes the equally obvious but slightly counterintuitive point that you can't put food first. You can't put food first because food spoils and goes rotten. Why would you want to put food first? If you put food first, all you end up with is a fridge full of flies. Besides which, even well-fed people die. So is the world's greatest problem really hunger and malnutrition? Or is the world's greatest problem deeper? Do we really need food and rice and grain, or do we need something more? Do we need food that spoils or food that lasts? Jesus raises these questions in the Gospel of John chapter 6. As Jeremy said, we've been studying John's Gospel here at Rooftop in our series called Street Fighter. During this year and probably next year, we're going slowly through John's Gospel, which is a record of Jesus' ministry, and we're taking it in chunks. And right now we're in the middle chunk of John, in which Jesus goes toe-to-toe with his enemies. As we've seen already, Jesus was not afraid of a fight. And here in John 6, Jesus gets into it again with a crowd in the town of Capernaum. Now, because this story that we're going to look at this morning takes place in a sequence of other events that help give it meaning and context, let me go ahead and set the story up a bit before we jump into it and study it this morning. A chapter earlier than this story occurs, Jesus had been teaching a crowd by the Sea of Galilee when it had become late. Everybody was so mesmerized by his teaching that they had actually forgotten to go home. Imagine that. You come into church on Sunday morning and I'm just so mesmerizing. Next thing you know, it's 10 p.m. and you've forgotten to go home. Can you imagine that? I know it's kind of a joke, isn't it? Everybody had forgotten to go home. They had forgotten to eat. The disciples realized if they try and go home now, they're probably going to die from starvation. So to satisfy their hunger for the trip home, Jesus takes a few loaves and fish and makes a miraculous meal to feed them all. This is the famous feeding of the 5,000. Now, the people are all very, very impressed by this miracle, enough to demand Jesus as their leader right then, right there. Now, Jesus demurs because it's just not the right time for him. Then he sends his disciples across the Sea of Galilee, letting the crowd think that he's going to remain behind, maybe for some Q&A the next morning. That night, though, what happens? Looked at it last week. Sneaks across the lake, unbeknownst to the crowd, walks across the lake on foot. In the morning, the people who stayed behind to talk further with Jesus, they wake up and they look for him. They realize he's escaped to the other side of the lake. So they decide to actually make the long 5 to 10 mile journey, depending on where they were, on foot, the 5 to 10 mile journey around the north side of the Sea of Galilee to find him. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. Turns into a rather long story, so we're going to be breaking it up, half this week, half the next story, or half next week. But I'm going to start in chapter 6, verse 25. You can follow along in your programs, on the screens, or radically in your Bibles. 6:25. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Then they asked him, "Well, what must we do to do the work God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." So they asked him, "What sign then will you give, that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he, Moses, gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me and still you do not believe. All the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day." Now, when I first read this passage, it actually seemed very complex. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth here. It's easy to get lost in the dialogue. It's a lot of Old Testament allusions, metaphorical statements about bread, theological statements about the Son of Man and such. But really, the dialogue is actually very easy to follow if you just slow it down a bit and follow it step by step. In fact, that's actually what we're going to do this morning. You're not going to get 3 points this morning. I know. The marvel. Not going to get 3 more points this morning. We're just actually going to walk through the dial a little bit and make sure we're tracking with the back and forth. And hopefully I'll be able to make some insightful spiritual comments along the way. Here goes. The crowd arrives to Capernaum looking for Jesus. They find him, but they are surprised and kind of confused at how he got there. They ask him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Now, like I said, the people saw his disciples leave, but not him. There was only one boat, so they have no idea how he got there. We know how he got there. We walked across the lake. Man can make pretty good time when he can walk across water. How much time, by the way, would the Indians have saved if they could have just walked across the Pacific Ocean instead of having to head north all the way up into that Bering Strait, way up there north in the Arctic? I mean, I'm sure if some guy had figured out how to do that, they had kind of made their way all the way around there. We would have asked him the same question. How long have you been here in North America? Regardless, maybe we should stick to 3 points, right? This is what happens. This reminds me of the Bering Strait. Regardless, Jesus ignores their question. Not only does he ignore their question, but he actually questions their motives for making the trip. Here's what he says. He says, You're looking for me, not because you saw the miraculous signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. So over on the other side of the lake, Jesus had miraculously provided a large meal for everybody there. He had provided this meal for two reasons. One, everybody was hungry. Two, he wanted to provide some goods, demonstrate to them that he had the authority to back up everything that he had said, that he could actually do this. And Jesus correctly discerns that the crowd that has followed him all the way around the northern side of the lake, they have not arrived because they have thought about it prayerfully. They have discussed amongst themselves that they've decided he is the Son of God, and they have decided to follow him, go all in, believe him, go wherever he goes. He correctly discerns that's not why they have made the trip. Why have they made the trip? They're hungry. They had their fill. They wanted another meal. And I should point out, Jesus does not give it to them. They come hungry. Jesus doesn't give them another meal. He actually gives them trouble. And this is one of a few stories in the Bible where Jesus does not give the people what they want. And I actually find this very interesting because of how important this problem was to them. They were poor, hungry people. Poor, hungry people, poor and hungry enough to walk several miles around a lake to get another handout, and Jesus tells them no. Can you imagine, by the way, this happening at the food pantry? We help out with the Afton Christian Food Pantry, which is a favorite around here. Can you imagine one of the food pantry clients showing up some Thursday night when Rooftop runs the pantry? People show up after a long day of work, working hard to make ends meet, support their family. They show up at the food pantry for some, and I don't know, Kevin Harmon says, "I know why you're here. It's not going to work. We figured you out. You're here just because you're hungry. You ate the bread, you had your fill, and now you want some more." And they say, yeah, I thought that was the idea. And they say, Kevin says, "What do you think this is? A food pantry?" Maybe it's not the same. But Jesus tells these very hungry people, no. Not going to give you another sandwich. I gave you a sandwich to prove to you that I could. Now you should know that I can. If I gave you another sandwich, you'd turn me into a social service agency. That's not why I'm here. It's a reminder to me that sometimes Jesus does not give us what we think we need, regardless of how important it seems to us. I mean, they're hungry. They need food. He says, no. It's a reminder, Jesus does not give us what we think we need, even though we think it's super important. We only think we need food. We only think we need health. We only think we need happiness. Getting ahead of myself here, though. We'll get to that. Jesus goes on. He tells the crowd, don't work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life. Jesus says there's two types of food. Food that spoils and food that endures. And we work for both. Don't work for food that spoils, work for food that endures. Both require a lot of work. The crowd had just walked halfway around a lake on an empty stomach for a meal. Talk about work. We all know how much work it can take to stay well fed. My parents worked their tails off just to keep us alive. My dad was out working this job for 45 years he didn't really enjoy, just to bring home the bacon, and my mom was just in the kitchen cooking the bacon. Whenever Michelle is gone, my wife is gone, and I'm in charge of the kids, I sort of rediscover how demanding it is just keeping your children alive. You get up, you make breakfast, you clean up, they want a snack, give them a snack, time for lunch, give them lunch, clean up, give them another snack, go grocery shopping, think about dinner, make dinner, clean up from dinner, go to bed, get up for breakfast. It's a lot of work just eating. I read the other day that the typical 4-person American family on a moderate eating plan spends on average $847 per month on food. The average single female spends $250 per month on food. On average, 10% of what Americans make goes towards their stomachs. 1 out of every $10 literally goes down the toilet. And that's actually low compared to the rest of the world. In Kenya, 45% of anything a Kenyan makes goes towards just sustaining their bodies. It's a lot of work just to eat. And Jesus is just pointing out the irony here that food just ends up spoiling anyway. Everything has an expiration date. Manufacturers are doing a good job of increasing the shelf life of certain foodstuffs, but everything expires. Even MREs expire. You know what an MRE is? Meal ready to eat. They were invented for astronauts to get lost in space. It can last forever. It lasts through a nuclear attack. Or is that Twinkies? One of those foods can last through a nuclear attack. I don't know how I ever discovered that. Hey, try and eat that Twinkie there, see if it kills you. Anyway, MREs, they don't last forever. A manufacturer says MREs last 5 years. Soldiers in the field actually say 11 is pushing it. I thought that was funny. Everything expires. And Jesus asks, why would you work so hard for food that spoils anyway? And if you think about it, this is rather gutsy of Jesus. Remember, he's talking to poor people. Social liberals might call this rather insensitive. It almost sounds like Jesus is telling poor people, just give up. You're going to lose. What's the point of it all? Now, is he telling them that, or is he just pointing out the irony that we work really, really hard to provide food for our stomachs, but on the flip side, we don't work nearly as hard for the food that lasts? We spend our entire lives just preparing for death, just eating, but we don't work nearly as hard for the food that can actually keep you going. If you're going to walk halfway around a lake, work for food that lasts. He doesn't say what the food is. He just says it's out there. There is a food that lasts. The crowd is intrigued. I mean, if you were in the crowd and you said, food that lasts. It's like how you imagine people when they first heard about refrigeration. Food that lasts. Wow, tell me more. They lean in. Food that lasts. And they ask him, what must we do to do the work God requires? So Jesus has just said that we shouldn't work for food that spoils, but for food that endures, and that's why they ask this question the way they do. Well, if you got to work for food, what should we do to work for the food that lasts? What's the work that God requires? Then Jesus gets kind of complicated, though. To their question, what should we do to do the work God requires? Jesus replies, well, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. That's how you get the food that lasts forever, to believe in the one God has sent. Now, he is obviously referring to whom? Himself. He is the one that God has sent, and that's how you get the food that lasts, the food that endures. Believe in the one who is sent. The people are a little confused and skeptical. This is taking a different turn than they expected. They probably actually thought that Jesus was talking about magical food that lasts forever. They probably thought he was talking about some Monsanto product. You know Monsanto, they make the food that lasts, the Frankenfood. Plant seeds wherever, plant seeds in the dirt, in the sand, in the carpet, it just grows up into magic corn. They actually thought he was talking about something like that, food that lasts. But then he starts in a different direction. He said, believe in me, that's the work. And the people don't really know what to make of this. They start wondering again who this guy is anyway, making these claims of coming from God and food that lasts forever. So you can actually see them in the conversation. You can kind of see and feel them draw back a little bit. Food that lasts, believe in him. This is starting to get a little weird. So they ask him a question about his credentials. John writes, so they asked, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors, the Hebrews, ate the manna, the bread in the wilderness. As it is written, Moses gave them bread from heaven to eat. So the crowd wants supernatural reason to believe that Jesus knows what he's talking about concerning this food that lasts forever. They point out to him that even Moses, their Old Testament prophet hero, performed a miracle in the wilderness to sustain their people, and they believed him because of that. I don't want to assume everybody knows about Moses. You know who Moses is? The original Old Testament Hebrew prophet. He led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, but then they got stuck in the desert, and they weren't able to grow food. Monsanto wasn't around yet. So Moses worked out this deal with God where he provided them manna or bread in the wilderness, which sustained them for 40 years. And because Moses was able to do this, they believed him. And the crowd's saying, all right, Moses did that and we believed him. What miracle can you do? What sign can you show us that we can believe you about this bread that lasts forever and this coming from God thing? What can you do? Now, this is a very interesting question. Why is it an interesting question? He just fed the crowd in Moses-like fashion 24 hours before. The exact same miracle. Jesus had fed the Jews in the wilderness. They had made the trip too quickly, hadn't packed enough food. Jesus snapped his fingers and fed everybody. That was the same miracle Moses had done. If I were Jesus and they asked me for a sign to prove I'm from God, I'd be like, well, how about, the sign I did, I don't know, maybe yesterday. Not to get too technical, but this is one of the reasons why scholars have a hard time putting these two stories together. How can people be so impressed by Jesus and his miraculous sign one day, but then demand another sign the very next day? It's actually why some critical scholars think the story doesn't make sense and that some of the details have been invented and invented badly at that. On the other hand, I can understand this. I can understand how the people saw one miracle one day and demanded another one the next day, having forgotten about the one the day before. Why can I understand this? It happens all the time in my life. I see a sign from God one day, I'm totally in love with him, will go wherever he wants me to go. You know those days, God, thank you for your blessings, you're my rock, I'm there, I'll go wherever you take me. The next day, I'm not moving. I need more food. Give me another. More. You know what that is? It's a sign we taught our kids, when you want more food, more. Then they're sitting at the high chair, more fan. I want more. So I can understand, though not excuse, the crowd's demand. They wanted another sign. Moses showed us a sign. What can you show us? Thankfully, Jesus is patient with his people, right? Thankfully, Jesus is patient with his people. He doesn't unleash on them as I would if I were him. Instead of unleashing on them, he corrects them. And he clarifies to his people. Very truly, I tell you. By the way, that phrase, very truly, I tell you. You know this phrase that appears all over the New Testament? Very truly, I tell you. Whenever Jesus says that, he's sort of acknowledging that we're not going to remember everything he says, but if we're going to remember something he says, remember this. In Greek, the word is amen, amen. It's translated, very truly I tell you, or very verily I say unto thee, if you read the KJV. So anytime you see this, very truly I tell you, just kind of listen, if you haven't been listening. Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. One more time. Very truly I tell you, sentences deserve to be repeated. It is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. In other words, Moses wasn't the one that gave your ancestors that bread. That was not Moses' doing. Whose doing was that? God's. God gave you that bread, and God is giving you this bread. And this bread, the bread I am giving you, is what Jesus calls true bread, bread of God. I like this. I like it because it reminds me that there's bread and there's bread. Not all breads are created equal. Jesus says there's bread and then there's true bread. Not all breads are equal. Bunny bread, for example. It's not real bread. It's just chemicals and corn derivatives processed and molded into something that looks like bread. You know bunny bread? You guys know bunny bread? Is that what it's called? What's it called? That's what I said. Bunny bread. Boom. You might not have enjoyed that, but I really did. That's not real bread, it's fake bread. Try going to an actual bread store for some real bread. My mom used to make real bread at home in the oven. It was like the real deal. You had to slice it yourself. Then she actually sold out. She got this bread maker. Remember when those were invented? And you put everything in, stirs it up for you, and you pull it out. It's like authentic homemade. She kept calling it homemade bread, but it came out in the shape of a cube. So slice something off the bread cube. Have some bread cube, but it's still better than bunny bread. Or, go to Macaroni Grill. Oh, Michelle, my wife, loves macaroni bread, grill bread. It just comes, you dip it in the oil, yeah. Or go to Breadco from handcrafted artisan bread. That's what they call it, handcrafted artisan bread. What is handcrafted artisan bread? Bread made by artists with their hands as opposed to garbage collectors with their feet. Handcrafted artisan bread. Not all breads are alike. There's bread, and then there's true bread. Jesus is talking about true bread. Compared to true bread, other breads are just false. And even the bread Moses gave them in the wilderness was false bread. It didn't last. Jesus came to give true bread that lasts forever. The people are satisfied and intrigued again, satisfied and curious and still very, very hungry. They place their order. They lean in, they say, "Sir, give us this bread." Now, if I can pause for a second, let me point out that Jesus has used this same sort of sales strategy before. It's called dualism. Everybody say dualism. Dualism. Dualism for two. Dual, two. Get it? Jesus is talking about one thing, while the people think he's talking about something else. The people think he's talking about food that literally lasts forever. Actual eternal bread they can eat forever, bread that never spoils. Jesus is speaking dualistically, though. For him, true bread isn't actual bread that never spoils. For him, true bread is a metaphor for God. The God who sustains us, that's the connection, the God who sustains us eternally through belief in his Son. That's the true bread, the God who sustains us. The people think he's talking about everlasting magic bread, but he's talking about God. What's interesting to me is that Jesus lets this play out. Jesus knows they don't understand what he's talking about. But he keeps describing to them this bread, letting them think it's eternal magic bread that lasts forever. He keeps describing and getting them interested in this bread until they're ready to bite. Get it? Bite. Like I said, Jesus has used this strategy before. Remember the woman at the well. Remember the woman at the well? Should have ended up there. Jesus meets this woman at the well in John chapter 4. She's drawing water. Jesus tells her he knows where she can get water that once she drinks it she will make her never thirst again. She's skeptical, just like the crowd is. There's no water like that takes away her thirst forever. But Jesus keeps making the sale. ABC, always be closing. Yes, there is such water. And I know you need it. You come here every day to draw water to drink, day after day after day. You're here at the well, making the trip in the heat and the dust. What if I gave you water that would take away your thirst forever? And finally she bites. "Sir, give me this water." And he's using the same strategy with these hungry people. What if I could give you bread that lasts forever, that would make you live forever, just like the woman they placed their order? "Sir, always give us this bread." Finally, with the fish on the hook, what do you do when you got the fish on the hook? You jerk. He jerks the rod, gets to the point. What does he say? "I am the bread. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never grow hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Bread was always just a metaphor for what they really needed. What they really needed wasn't food or water or shelter or companionship. What they really need is God. It's the reason we're actually not going down to Mexico to build a house. We're going down to Mexico to tell people about Jesus. The house will collapse. The house will float away. Actually, down there, houses float away. I'm not kidding. The Rio Grande floods, these people are too poor to build their house up on the plain, so they build it, or up here, so they build it down on the plain, the river plain. And every year, the Rio Grande floods, and the houses float away. And then we get back there, and the houses are like in different places because they float away. Houses float away. We're going down there to tell them about Jesus. Our opportunity to do that is facilitated by the fact that they need a house. That's why the African Christian Food Pantry, ironically, radically, we're actually not there to feed people. We're there to feed people. To feed them the gospel while giving them a banana or whatever they need. And what's important for you and I to know in all this is that Jesus still uses this same dualistic strategy with you and I. He promises us what we think we need in greater terms than we can ever imagine, explaining, though, that ultimately what we need is Him. What I mean is, we all have bread that we work for. We all think we need something and work really hard to get it. Might not be bread, might be water, but it's something. There's something we think we need that we work really hard for. Maybe our bread, for example, is companionship. We think we need companionship. We look really hard for it. We look for it, we work for it, we sign up for dating websites, we go out on terribly awkward dates because we think we need companionship. Maybe our bread is a family. We work really hard to start a family. We see specialists, we chart calendars, we endure with children. Maybe our bread is a new job. We perfect that resume. We schedule those interviews. We go back to school for job training. Maybe our bread is a healthy savings account. We scrimp, we save, we invest. We work to provide for the future. We all have bread we need and work hard for. Here's the question, though. What's your bread? What is it you think you really need? What would you walk halfway around the lake on an empty stomach to get? Jesus knows you need that, and He wants to give it to you. He wants to give it to you in ways you can't even imagine. He wants to give you bread that never spoils, water that never runs dry, a companion that's a perfect fit, a family that will never hurt you, a savings account that will never dwindle, a job you will never lose. He's here this morning telling you He can do those things. He's promising us He can, setting the hook, making us lean in, leading us to that moment where we slap our money down and we say, "Sir, give us this bread. Give me that husband. Give me that job. Give me that savings account." But then He tells you what He's really talking about. He's not really talking about bread or companions or family or savings accounts. He's talking about Himself. He is our true companion. He is our true family, our true savings, our true bread. All those other things will never satisfy us. We think they will, but they don't. Bread spoils, water evaporates, jobs dry up, houses float away, savings account gets spent, spouses leave you, families break up. But Jesus will never spoil, evaporate, leave you, or get spent. He is the true bread. All we have to do is what? Believe. That is the work God requires. So do you believe? Do you believe that bigger than what you think you need is the God you really need, who can be everything and more that you think you want? That's what we remember when we celebrate communion. We celebrate communion on the third week of the month here at Rooftop, and this morning communion is all about that. The bread and the cup remind us of Christ and the food and the drink that He is, which allow us to live forever. They remind us that He is the true bread here at Rooftop. We believe that the bread we eat during communion, it's actually just bread. A lot of denominations, it turns into something else. It's actually, we believe it's bread. I mean, if we leave it out, what's going to happen? It's going to get stale and green. But it represents something bigger than that. It represents the bread that he really is to us, the everything he is to us. And it's a reminder that we don't really need this. We need him. So if you believe that, we invite you to join us in communion this morning. We practice open communion here at Rooftop, which means anybody can participate, anybody who identifies themselves as a follower of Christ by the historic definition of that, people who have repented of their sins, people who believe in Jesus as the unique Son of God, and people who have been baptized for the forgiveness of their sins. Anybody who wants to join us at the communion table can do that in a second. The ushers are going to come down. You can come on down when you're ready. Take some bread, dip it in the cup, and remember the God who died to give you life forever. Afterwards, I'll come back up and we'll pray and conclude the service.